Aquarius workshop Trusting the Involuntary Processes. I start with a quote from Pathwork Lecture 153 with the title The Self-Regulating Nature of Involuntary Processes. And the quote is as follows: Unless you trust the involuntary processes, the exaggerated ego control cannot be relinquished, and you can never convince yourself of the benign nature of these creative forces within you. Productive, creative, involuntary processes cannot become operative as long as you do not encourage them, as long as you do not wish them and give yourself to them. End of quote from Pathwork Lectures 153. The emotionally immature person fears the creative life of the involuntary processes and prefers to cling to the separate, foolish ego because he believes in the illusion that only the ego is safe. But this person is out of balance because of the too tight ego control and the rejection of the involuntary processes, which creates illness and neurosis. However, he believes in the delusion that in order to become healthier, he must strengthen that control by exerting even more pressure. As a result of this wasted willpower and energy, and this rigid vigilance, he creates a vicious circle that creates conflict, unhappiness, and an empty life. The stronger his ego control, the greater his self-alienation, the more problems in life, and the less his ability to deal with them. His fear and distrust are caused by unconscious negative images and misconceptions that destructively influence the involuntary processes. How can the emotional immature person come to trust the involuntary processes? First, he must let go of his illusions about himself, realize the untruths of his images, dissolve them, and imprint true ideas in his soul substance. Then he must let go of ego control, encourage the involuntary processes, and surrender to them in the realization that they regulate themselves just as perfectly as, for example, the internal bodily functions. He can trust that nature regulates itself according to perfect laws, but he must use the ego to teach healthy living habits. The involuntary processes cannot be controlled by the ego will, but can only be influenced indirectly in a positive or negative way. They respond indirectly to his choice for voluntary self-responsibility, for healthy nutrition, to want to be in truth, to be honest and true to oneself, to cherish healthy self-love and good self-care, to move in a relaxed way, to treat the body as a precious gift, to observe feelings and thoughts, to accept and feel emotions, honest self-disclosure, unconditional love, etc. In this workshop you will explore with a loving curiosity 3 themes of the Pathwork Lectures regarding the involuntary processes. The first theme, letting go of ego control. The greatest conflict in every human being is on the one hand the soul's desire for surrender to the involuntary processes, and on the other hand the strong fear of those inner processes because we do not want to let go of the ego control. In the struggle to let go of the small ego and to develop ourselves into an Aquarian person, we need to remove 3 barriers. The first barrier between the conscious and unconscious areas of our psyche. The second barrier between ourselves and our partner. And the third barrier between ourselves and the inner cosmic life stream. Only when we dare to let go of the little ego will we live and reach out fully. Then we will experience surrender to death as a blissful union. Then you will trust the live stream of organic events and understand that our present situation is exactly what we need now for our development process. The next quote stems from Pathwork Lecture 138. With a completely constructive psyche, the personality can trust its spontaneous, unchecked, free expressions. It can give itself up to the inner power so that a free-flowing, vibrating unity between the self and the life force exists. This appears like an act which relinquishes direct control. And through this act, more constructive powers deep in the core of the self are activated, which make the self forever more adequate and give it more control over life, determining its own fate in the best possible way. End of quote from Pathwork Lecture 138. The second theme, the task of the ego. It is the ego's task to find a harmonious balance between the forces of discipline and surrender, so that the ego is released and can integrate with the involuntary processes. The ego must be careful not to distort discipline and surrender in a harmful way and abuse it against the truth by choosing unhealthy attitudes and the path of least resistance. These negative attitudes form a thick wall of defense that can lead to escapism, addictions, or even total neglect. These distortions can manifest themselves in two extremes. On the one hand, in a tense, rigid, inhibited, insensitive, vigilant person, and on the other hand, in someone without any discipline who flees from himself. A person changes by honestly facing himself in truth and giving the best of himself and letting go in a relaxed way. With this positive attitude to life, he can fully trust the power of the involuntary processes. The next quote stems from Pathwork Lecture 153. When the ego no longer dominates these involuntary processes, intuition will give a new security and help to cope with life. Thoughts will come from the deepest resources of the solar plexus, rather than the volitional, artificial thought processes man is used to when overemphasizing the intellect. He is used to the imbalance without even knowing what he does and what he misses. When the self-regulating nature is experienced, the involuntary processes integrate with the ego functions. Then and then only can life be truly fulfilling and rich. A new freedom exists to receive what comes from within. One is being lived from within. This is self-realization. And then one can see how these involuntary processes are in their health, as trustworthy and as self-regulating as a body functioning in health. An integrated full life is absolutely impossible if these involuntary faculties are not allowed to be. End of quote of Pathwork Lecture 153. The third and last theme, surrender to the involuntary processes. The Aquarian person has integrated the ego with the true self, whereby the soul substance with its infinitely great power works constructively and positively. This integration has a positive effect on the productive, creative, and voluntary processes which their spontaneous feelings and thoughts, inspiration, intuition, and wisdom, from which everything that is meaningful, fulfilling, and of real value originates. Because this person is free from images and misconceptions and knows that these involuntary processes work positively when they are guided by correct assumptions, he trusts the perfection of the self-acting power of these involuntary processes. The last quote stems from Pathwork Lecture 254. The surrender of self-will is always an act toward God, for His will alone must replace your self-will. but sometimes His will can function only through others before it can manifest directly through you. It is God's will that you also surrender to the spiritual leadership He has guided you to. It is God's will that you surrender to some of the most beautiful and voluntary processes within yourself, for instance, your love feelings, your deepest intuitions. It is God's will that you become capable of yielding, as it is His will that you become capable of fighting and standing firm. End of quote from Pathwork Lecture 254. I wish you peace and all the best. Thank you.